Homeless girl warns millionaire, don't drink that water, it's poisoned. And before we continue, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more gripping stories like this. Enjoy the story. The city buzzed with life as the late afternoon sun cast its golden glow over downtown Chicago. Cars honked in slow-moving traffic, street vendors called out their wares, and the rhythmic clatter of footsteps filled the sidewalks. Richard Devereaux sat in the back seat of his sleek black sedan, parked outside an upscale cafe. He glanced at his watch impatiently, his sharp blue eyes narrowing as he checked his phone for updates. His tailored suit, perfectly pressed, radiated wealth and power, an image he had cultivated over decades. A waiter emerged from the cafe, balancing a tray with a single glass of water. Richard barely glanced up as the man approached a car, his focus locked on the screen in his hand. From across the street, Lila watched intently, her heart pounding in her chest. She stood partially hidden behind a row of parked bikes, her worn hoodie pulled tight around her thin frame. To anyone else, she was just another vagrant blending into the chaos of the city. But Lila's eyes were locked on the tray. Her stomach churned as she saw the waiter glance nervously over his shoulder. From his pocket, he pulled a small vial, tilting it carefully as he poured its contents into the glass. The liquid disappeared instantly, leaving no visible trace. Lila's mind raced. She had seen this before, too many times to count, and she knew what it meant: poison. For a moment, she froze, the weight of fear paralyzing her. She could stay where she was, let the moment pass, and walk away unnoticed. Or she could act. Her pulse thundered in her ears as she made her choice. "Don't drink that water," she screamed, her voice cutting through the air like a razor. Heads turned as her cry pierced the din of the street. Richard looked up sharply, his brows furrowing as he spotted the disheveled young woman sprinting toward his car. His driver, a no-nonsense man named Harris, immediately stepped out, intercepting her before she could reach the vehicle. "Back off," Harris barked, his large frame towering over her. "What do you think you're doing?" Lila skidded to a halt, her breath coming in quick gasps. "I'm trying to save his life," she shot back, her green eyes blazing with urgency. "That waiter poisoned the water. I saw him do it." Richard opened the car door, his movements deliberate and calm. He stepped out, straightening his jacket as his piercing gaze swept over her. "What's going on here?" he asked, his tone sharp but controlled. "This girl claims the water's poisoned," Harris explained, his voice heavy with skepticism. "She's probably just looking for attention. It's not a lie." Lila insisted, stepping closer. "Please, you have to believe me. I saw him." He poured something into the glass. Richard studied her, his expression unreadable. Her clothes were frayed, her face pale, and her sneakers caked with grime. She looked every bit the part of a desperate street dweller. But her eyes, there was something in them. A fire. Desperation, yes, but also determination. She believed every word she was saying. "Where's the waiter now?" Richard asked, his voice calm. Lila pointed toward the cafe entrance. He went back inside. "He's probably watching us right now." Richard turned his head, just in time to see a man in a crisp white uniform dart through the cafe's back door. His jaw tightened. The man's sudden departure was enough to make him hesitate. He looked at the glass of water, still untouched on the tray, and then back at Lila. "What's your name?" he asked. "Lila," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "All right, Lila," Richard said, his tone measured. "Why would you risk running across the street to warn me? What do you get out of this?" Lila swallowed hard, glancing around as if the answer might leap from the crowd. "Because I know what they do to people," she said quietly. "And I couldn't just stand by and let it happen again." Richard's sharp eyes softened ever so slightly. He gestured for Harris to lower his guard. "Get in the car," he said to Lila. Harris's brow furrowed. "Sir, are you sure?" "She could be—" "I said, get in the car," Richard repeated, his tone brooking no argument. Lila hesitated for a split second, then climbed into the back seat. She sank into the plush leather, her thin hands clutching the edge of the seat. Harris returned to the driver's side, throwing her a wary glance before starting the engine. As the car pulled away from the curb, Richard turned to face her. "Start talking," he said. "Who are you? And why do you know so much about this?" Lila's shoulders tensed. "I used to work for them," she admitted. "Not directly, but enough to know how they operate. They use people, waiters, delivery drivers, anyone who can get close without being noticed. They paid that waiter to spike your drink." Richard's jaw tightened. "Why me? What do they want?" "They think you have something that could expose them," Lila said. "I don't know what it is, but they're scared you'll use it." Before Richard could press further, his phone buzzed. He pulled it from his pocket and frowned at the screen. It was a text from an unknown number. "You've been warned. Stay out of this." He turned the screen toward Lila. "Did you tell anyone you were coming to me?" "No," she exclaimed, shaking her head vehemently. "They're watching you, not me." Richard's eyes narrowed as he considered her words. His instincts told him she was telling the truth, but trust didn't come easily to a man like him. "Harris," he said, his voice steady, "take us to the safe house." Lila's head snapped up. "Safe house? You have one. Do you have a better idea?" Richard replied curtly. She fell silent, her mind racing as the car weaved through the city's busy streets. Outside, the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the pavement. Lila's heart pounded as she glanced at Richard, who sat quietly, his expression unreadable. She had risked everything to warn him, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the danger was far from over. As the car sped toward its destination, a shadow moved in the cafe's doorway. A man in a gray suit stepped out, his cold eyes following the vehicle as it disappeared into the distance. He pulled a phone from his pocket, speaking into it in low, clipped tones. "They've left," he said. "Prepare the team. We'll make our move soon." The sleek black sedan glided through the darkening streets, its tinted windows reflecting the neon glow of the city. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Lila sat stiffly, her hands gripping the edge of the seat as if the car might vanish beneath her. Across from her, Richard Devereaux studied her with the intensity of a man used to uncovering lies. "So," Richard began, his tone sharp but even, "you used to work for them. Care to elaborate?" Lila's throat felt dry, her nerves fraying under his gaze. She hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "I didn't have a choice," she said finally. "I was just a kid when I got involved. They find people like me, people with nowhere to go, nothing to lose, and use them. And now you're not with them anymore," Richard said, his eyes narrowing. "Why?" "They think I'm dead," Lila admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "And I've done everything I can to keep it that way." Harris, the driver, snorted. "Convenient story. How do we know she's not leading us into a trap?" Lila's green eyes flashed with indignation. "If I wanted him dead," she said, jerking her thumb toward Richard, "I wouldn't have screamed in the middle of the street. Do you think that's the kind of plan they'd come up with?" Richard raised a hand, silencing Harris. "Let her talk." Lila glanced out the window, watching the city blur past. "I was a runner," she said. "I carried packages, delivered messages. At first, I didn't ask questions. I was just trying to survive. But then I started noticing things. People disappearing, whispers about punishments. When I tried to leave, they made it clear that wasn't an option." Richard leaned back in his seat, his expression unreadable. "And yet, here you are." "I got lucky," Lila said bitterly. "I faked my death and disappeared. But that doesn't mean they're not looking for me. Silence filled the car for a moment, broken only by the hum of the engine. Richard's mind raced as he pieced together her story. It was plausible, but plausibility wasn't proof. He had built his empire on gut instinct and an uncanny ability to spot deception. And right now, Lila's desperation felt genuine. "Why warn me?" he asked, breaking the silence. "What do you gain by putting yourself in danger?" Lila hesitated, her fingers knotting together. "Because I know what they're capable of," she said finally. "I've seen it. And someone once helped me when they didn't have to. I couldn't just stand by and let it happen again." Richard studied her, his piercing blue eyes searching for cracks in her story. "You're either telling the truth," he said slowly, "or you're the best liar I've ever met." Lila's jaw tightened. "Believe whatever you want. I've done my part. If you don't want to listen, that's on you." Richard's phone buzzed, breaking the tension. He glanced at the screen, his brow furrowing. Another message from an unknown number. "We don't give second chances. Walk away." He turned the screen toward Lila. "Explain this." She paled. "They know you're asking questions. That's all it takes. Once they think you're a threat, they won't stop." Richard's lips pressed into a thin line. "Harris, how far are we?" 2 minutes, Harris replied, his tone grim. "But if they're tracking us..." "They're not," Richard interrupted. "Not yet." Lila shook her head. "You don't understand. These people, they don't just rely on technology. They have eyes everywhere. Waiters, janitors, drivers. Anyone could be working for them." Richard arched a brow. "Including you." Lila glared at him, her voice rising. "If I was working for them, you'd already be dead." The car fell silent again, her words hanging heavily in the air. Richard's gaze didn't waver, but for the first time, there was a flicker of something else in his expression, perhaps doubt or maybe trust. Harris turned onto a narrow street, the towering buildings giving way to industrial warehouses. The safe house loomed ahead, an unassuming brick structure that blended into its surroundings. He pulled the car to a stop, killing the engine. "We're here," Harris announced. "But if they're really watching, we've got company." Richard stepped out first, his sharp gaze scanning the area. The street was quiet, but he knew better than to trust appearances. He gestured for Lila to follow, his hand resting lightly on the inside of his jacket, where a small firearm was holstered. Lila hesitated before climbing out. She stayed close to him, her eyes darting nervously as they approached the building. "How do you know this place is safe?" she asked. "I don't," Richard replied bluntly. "But it's the best we've got." Inside, the safe house was sparse and utilitarian. A small kitchen occupied one corner, a couch and desk another. The walls were lined with shelves stacked with files and equipment. Richard moved quickly, powering up the laptop on the desk. Within moments, the screen was filled with encrypted files. "Sit," he said to Lila, motioning to the couch. She didn't argue, sinking into the worn cushions as Richard began sifting through the files. "If they're after me, there has to be a reason," he said, half to himself. "Something I've seen or touched that they can't afford to let out." Lila watched him work, her nerves still on edge. "You rejected one of their projects, didn't you?" she asked. Richard glanced at her, his fingers pausing over the keyboard. "The Orion Initiative," he said. "It didn't add up, so I turned it down." "That's why," Lila said, leaning forward. "That project wasn't just a front, it was one of their biggest operations. You rejecting it cost them millions, maybe more. They think you're holding on to something. Evidence, files, anything that could expose them. And are they right?" Richard asked, his tone sharp. Lila shook her head. "If you were, you'd already know. But they can't take that chance." Before either of them could say more, the lights in the room flickered. Then, with a sharp click, everything went dark. Richard stood immediately, his instincts kicking in. Backup power's been cut. Lila's breath caught. They're here, aren't they? Stay quiet, Richard ordered, moving to the wall where a small handgun was mounted. He retrieved it quickly, his movements precise. Lila crouched lower, her pulse thundering in her ears. Outside, the faint sound of footsteps echoed through the street. Whoever they were, they weren't far. "What do we do?" she whispered. Richard glanced at her, his expression unflinching. "We survive." The room plunged into darkness, the sudden loss of light amplifying the tension that already hung thick in the air. The hum of a laptop ceased, leaving only the sound of their breathing and the faint hum of traffic outside. Lila froze on the couch, her heart pounding in her chest. She strained her ears, listening for anything. Footsteps, whispers, the faintest sound that might signal what was coming. Richard moved immediately, his sharp instincts kicking in. He retrieved a flashlight from the desk drawer, clicking it on to cast a narrow beam of light. "Backup power's been cut," he muttered, his voice calm but firm. "Stay where you are." Lila's voice was a whisper, barely audible in the stillness. "They found us, didn't they?" Richard didn't respond right away, his mind racing as he considered their options. He moved to the shelves, pulling a small case down and opening it to reveal a sleek handgun and several spare magazines. "It's a possibility," he said, his tone carefully measured. "But we're not staying to find out." "What do we do?" Lila asked, her voice rising slightly with panic. "We can't just sit here." Richard turned to her, his flashlight casting shadows across his sharp features. "Listen carefully," he said. "Under the rug near the couch, there's a hatch. It leads to a tunnel that connects to another building a few blocks away. If things go south, you take that tunnel and don't look back." "What about you?" Lila demanded, standing from the couch. "I'll cover you," Richard replied, his tone leaving no room for argument. Before Lila could protest further, a faint noise reached their ears, a soft scrape, like metal on metal. Richard's head snapped toward the door, his eyes narrowing. He motioned for Lila to stay quiet, then moved toward the window, careful to stay out of sight. Peering through the corner of a glass, he spotted movement in the shadows outside. Figures dressed in dark clothing, their movements deliberate and precise. "They're here," he confirmed, his voice low. "Armed and coordinated." Lila's stomach twisted into knots. "How did they find us so fast?" "They've probably had eyes on me for days," Richard said, his mind already working through their options. "They waited until they thought I'd led them somewhere important." "What do we do?" Lila asked again, her voice trembling. Richard handed her the flashlight and a smoke grenade from the case. "Stay calm. If they get inside, you pull the pin on this and throw it. It'll buy us a few seconds." Lila stared at the grenade in her hand, her fingers trembling. "You're serious?" "I don't joke in situations like this," Richard said, loading the handgun with a clean, efficient motion. "Now, get to the hatch." The sound of a car door slamming outside made them both flinch. Richard's sharp eyes darted back to the window. The intruders were moving toward the building, their weapons drawn, their steps silent. One of them held a small device that blinked red, some kind of scanner or tracker. "They're sweeping the area," Richard muttered. "They'll find a way in soon." Lila crouched by the rug, her hands fumbling as she pulled it aside to reveal the metal hatch Richard had described. She hesitated, looking up at him. "I'm not leaving you behind. You don't have a choice," Richard said firmly. "If they catch us both, it's over." A loud crash echoed through the room as the front door splintered under the force of a battering ram. Lila let out a small gasp, scrambling to open the hatch. Richard took position behind the desk, his gun aimed at the doorway. The first figure stepped into the room, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. Richard waited until the man was fully inside before firing a single shot. The intruder dropped instantly, his weapon clattering to the floor. Chaos erupted as the others rushed in, their flashlights sweeping the space. "Now, Lila," Richard shouted over the commotion. "Go." She hesitated for only a second before climbing into the tunnel, the hatch slamming shut above her. The darkness of the narrow passage enveloped her, but she forced herself to keep moving. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she crawled forward, the sound of gunfire and shouting echoing faintly behind her. Back in the safe house, Richard fired another shot, forcing the intruders to scatter. He ducked behind the desk, his mind racing. He was outnumbered, but he wasn't going down without a fight. "Devereaux," a cold voice called out from the shadows. It was the man in the gray suit, his tone calm despite the chaos. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." Richard didn't respond, his grip tightening on the gun. He fired another shot, forcing the man to take cover. "You came all this way for nothing," Richard called out. "The files you're looking for don't exist." "You expect me to believe that?" the man replied, his voice carrying an edge of amusement. "We know you're hiding something. Hand it over, and maybe we'll let you walk out of here." Richard smirked, his tone defiant. "We both know that's a lie." The man chuckled softly. "You're right," he said, "but it was worth a try." Richard heard the faint click of a grenade pin being pulled and immediately ducked as the device was tossed into the room. Smoke filled the space, blinding him as he coughed and staggered toward the hatch. He dropped into the tunnel, pulling the metal door shut behind him. The air in the tunnel was cool and damp, the faint hum of the city above barely audible. Richard moved quickly, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. He caught up to Lila a few moments later, finding her crouched near a fork in the passage. "I thought you weren't coming," she said, her voice shaking. "I told you. I don't leave loose ends," Richard replied, motioning for her to follow. "Let's move." They pressed on, the narrow tunnel twisting and turning beneath the city. Every sound seemed amplified. Their footsteps, their breathing, the occasional drip of water from the ceiling. Lila's mind raced with questions, but she kept them to herself, focusing instead on putting one foot in front of the other. "Where does this lead?" she asked finally, breaking the silence. "An old warehouse," Richard replied. "We'll regroup there and figure out our next move." Lila glanced at him, her green eyes filled with both fear and determination. "You think they'll follow us?" Richard's lips pressed into a thin line. "They'll try," he said, "but by the time they figure out where this tunnel leads, we'll be long gone." The cold night air greeted them as they emerged from the tunnel into the shadow of an old warehouse. The building stood tall and foreboding, its rusted metal siding reflecting the faint glow of a nearby street lamp. Richard climbed out first, scanning their surroundings with sharp, practiced eyes. Lila followed close behind, her movements hesitant as she pulled herself up and out of the narrow hatch. "Is this the plan?" Lila asked, her breath still unsteady. "Hiding in a warehouse?" Richard gave her a sidelong glance. "It's not about hiding," he said. "It's about positioning." Lila frowned, brushing dirt off her hands. "Positioning for what? We're still outnumbered, and they'll find us eventually." "They will," Richard replied, his voice calm and measured. "But they'll come in blind, and that gives us the upper hand." He led her into the warehouse, his movements swift and deliberate. The interior was just as desolate as the outside, with stacks of rusted crates, discarded machinery, and cobweb-covered scaffolding. The faint smell of oil and decay lingered in the air, adding to the oppressive atmosphere. Richard moved to a crate near the back wall and pried it open, revealing a stash of supplies, weapons, flashlights, and a small tactical tablet. He handed Lila a flashlight and a smoke grenade. "Here," he said, "in case things go south." Lila took them reluctantly, her fingers tightening around the cold metal. "I don't know how to use any of this." "Pull the pin and throw," Richard said flatly. "That's all you need to know." She stared at the grenade, her chest tightening. "You've done this before, haven't you?" Richard didn't look at her, as he loaded a rifle with smooth, practiced movements. More times than I'd like to admit. Lila leaned against a crate, her mind racing. How can you stay so calm? They're coming for us. And you act like it's just another day at the office. Because panic gets you killed, Richard said, his voice firm but not unkind. And right now, staying alive is all that matters. Before Lila could respond, the faint sound of engines echoed through the night, growing louder with each passing second. Richard tensed, his gaze snapping toward the warehouse entrance. "They're here," he muttered. Lila's stomach dropped as she heard the unmistakable screech of tires. She peered through a crack in the metal siding, her heart pounding as two black SUVs came into view. Armed men stepped out, their movements precise and methodical. They spread out, flashlights sweeping across the exterior of the warehouse. "They're searching for an entry point," Richard said, more to himself than to her. He moved to the tactical tablet, pulling up a blueprint of the warehouse. "There are two main entrances and one side door. They'll try to split up and cover all three." "And what do we do?" Lila asked, her voice trembling. "We make them come to us," Richard replied, a grim determination in his tone. He handed her a radio. "Stay near the back. If I tell you to move, you move. No questions." Lila hesitated, her fingers gripping the radio tightly. "And what about you?" "I'll keep them busy," Richard said, slinging the rifle over his shoulder. "If they want me, they'll have to earn it." The sound of footsteps echoed outside as the intruders began their approach. Lila's pulse quickened as she crouched behind a stack of crates, trying to make herself as small as possible. Richard positioned himself near the main entrance, his rifle trained on the door. He exhaled slowly, his focus razor-sharp. The first loud bang came moments later, the main door shaking as someone attempted to force it open. Richard waited, his finger hovering over the trigger. A second bang followed, then a third, before the door finally gave way, swinging open with a metallic groan. Two men stepped inside, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. Richard fired a single shot, hitting one in the leg. The man dropped with a cry of pain, his weapon clattering to the floor. The second man shouted something into his radio, retreating behind a crate. "Devereaux," a familiar voice called out. It was the man in the gray suit, his tone calm despite the chaos. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." Richard didn't reply, his attention fixed on the entrance. Another figure appeared in the doorway, and he fired again, forcing the man to dive for cover. "You should have stayed in the shadows," Richard muttered under his breath. Meanwhile, Lila crouched in the back, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She clutched the flashlight and grenade, her hands trembling as she listened to the chaos unfolding. The radio crackled to life in her hand, Richard's voice cutting through. "Move to the tunnel. Now, what about you?" she whispered back. "I'll be right behind you," Richard said. "Go." Lila hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to stay, but she forced herself to move. She crept toward the far corner of the warehouse, where another hatch was hidden beneath a pile of old crates. Her fingers fumbled as she pushed the crates aside, the sound of gunfire ringing in her ears. At the front of the warehouse, Richard continued to hold his ground, his shots precise and deliberate. He knew he couldn't hold them off forever, but he didn't need to. All he needed was time. "You can't win this," Devereaux, the man in the gray suit, called out, his voice echoing through the space. "Hand over the drive, and we'll let this end peacefully." Richard let out a dry laugh, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Peaceful isn't exactly your style." The man chuckled softly. "True, but you're running out of options." Richard's radio crackled. "I'm in the tunnel." Lila's voice came through, shaky but determined. "Good," Richard replied. "Stay there. I'm coming." He fired one last shot before retreating toward the back of the warehouse, his movements swift and practiced. The man in the gray suit watched him go, a faint smirk on his lips. "Follow him," he ordered his men. "But don't let him get too far. We need him alive." Richard reached the hatch just as the first of the intruders rounded the corner. He dropped into the tunnel, pulling the metal door shut above him. The sound of shouting faded as he descended into the darkness, his flashlight cutting through the gloom. Lila was waiting for him a few feet ahead, her face pale but resolute. "What now?" she asked. Richard placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Now we keep moving." They disappeared into the tunnel, the faint echoes of their pursuers fading behind them. But Richard knew the chase was far from over. The syndicate wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted, or until he was dead. The tunnel stretched on endlessly, its damp walls illuminated only by the narrow beams of their flashlights. Richard led the way, his steps purposeful and his expression unreadable. Lila followed close behind, her breath coming in shallow gasps as she struggled to keep up. Every step felt heavier than the last, the weight of their situation pressing down on her. "How far does this tunnel go?" she asked, her voice echoing softly in the confined space. "Far enough," Richard replied curtly. "It leads to an access point near the docks. We'll be safe there. Temporarily. Temporarily." Lila repeated, a note of panic creeping into her tone. "You mean they'll find us again?" "They'll keep looking," Richard admitted, glancing back at her. "But I have a plan." Lila exhaled sharply, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. "A plan? You've been one step ahead this whole time, but they're still right behind us. What kind of plan are we talking about?" Richard stopped abruptly, turning to face her. The flashlight in his hand cast shadows across his sharp features, making him look almost otherworldly. "The kind that ends this," he said, his voice low and resolute. "For good." Lila met his gaze, her green eyes searching his for any hint of doubt. She found none. Whatever Richard was planning, he believed in it completely. That should have been reassuring, but instead, it only made her more nervous. People who believed too strongly in their own plans often underestimated their enemies. They resumed walking, the silence between them thick with unspoken questions. Lila's mind raced as she replayed the events of the past few hours. The poisoned water, the chase, the gunfire. It all felt like a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. But one question loomed above all the others. "What's on that drive?" she asked finally. "What's so important that they're willing to kill you for it?" Richard's step slowed, and for a moment, she thought he might not answer. Then he spoke, his voice measured. "The Orion Initiative." Lila frowned. "That's what you rejected, isn't it? The project they pitched to you." Richard nodded. "It wasn't just a project. It was a front, a way to launder money, traffic information, and fund illegal operations. When I turned it down, I thought that was the end of it, but they didn't see it that way. They think you kept something," Lila said, piecing it together. "Evidence. Proof of what they were doing." "They're not wrong," Richard admitted. He stopped walking, pulling the small USB drive from his pocket. "This has everything. Emails, transactions, names. Enough to dismantle their entire operation." Lila stared at the drive, her stomach twisting. "And you've been carrying it with you this whole time?" "It's safer with me," Richard said simply. "If they get their hands on it, they'll destroy it, and anyone connected to it." Lila's mind reeled. She had known the syndicate was dangerous, but hearing Richard lay it out so plainly made it feel all the more real. "What's your plan?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I have a contact," Richard said, resuming their pace. "Someone with the resources to take this public. But we need to reach them first." "And you think they can stop the syndicate?" Lila asked, her tone skeptical. "They can shine a light on them," Richard said. "And that's the one thing the syndicate can't survive: exposure." As they continued through the tunnel, the faint hum of the city above grew louder. They were getting close to the access point. Richard's focus sharpened, his steps quickening. But Lila couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Her instincts, honed from years of living on the edge, were screaming at her. "Richard," she said cautiously, What if they're waiting for us? They won't be, Richard said, his confidence unwavering. This tunnel isn't on any maps. They don't know it exists. But what if they figured out? Lila pressed. You said they've been watching you. What if? Her words were cut off by a faint noise, a metallic clink, like the sound of a latch being opened. Richard froze, his flashlight snapping to the source of the noise. Ahead, the tunnel curved sharply, disappearing into darkness. The sound came again, louder this time, followed by the unmistakable echo of footsteps. They're here, Richard muttered, his jaw tightening. Lila's heart raced as she turned to him. What do we do? Richard motioned for her to move back. Stay behind me, he said, his voice steady. And whatever happens, don't stop moving. They retreated a few steps, their flashlights flicking off to avoid giving away their position. The footsteps grew louder, accompanied by low voices. Lila strained to hear what they were saying, but the echoes distorted the words. Richard crouched low, pulling his handgun from its holster. He gestured for Lila to do the same, and she obeyed, crouching behind a metal support beam. Her breath came in short, shallow gasps, her mind racing with fear. The first figure appeared around the bend, his silhouette barely visible in the dim light. Richard didn't hesitate. He fired a single shot, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. The man dropped instantly, his weapon clattering to the ground. Shouts erupted from the shadows as the other intruders scrambled for cover. Lila flinched, her hands gripping the edge of the beam. Richard, she whispered. There's too many. I know, he said, his voice calm. That's why we're not staying. He grabbed her arm, pulling her to her feet. Together, they sprinted toward the far end of the tunnel, the sound of gunfire echoing behind them. Richard fired over his shoulder, keeping their pursuers at bay as they moved. The tunnel sloped upward, the faint outline of an access hatch coming into view. Go, Richard shouted, shoving Lila forward. She climbed a ladder as fast as she could, her hands slipping on the damp metal rungs. When she reached the top, she pushed the hatch open, the cool night air hitting her face like a slap. She pulled herself up and out, turning to help Richard as he climbed behind her. They emerged into a deserted lot near the docks, the sound of waves crashing against the shore in the distance. Richard slammed the hatch shut, locking it from the outside. He turned to Lila, his face set with grim determination. They'll find another way out, he said. We don't have much time. Lila nodded, her chest heaving as she caught her breath. What now? Richard pulled the USB drive from his pocket, holding it up. We make the drop, he said, and we end this. The cool night air wrapped around them as Richard and Lila stood in the desolate lot near the docks. The sound of distant waves crashing against the shore mixed with the faint hum of the city behind them. Richard scanned the area, his sharp eyes assessing every shadow, every corner. The USB drive felt heavier in his pocket, as if it carried the weight of the world. We can't stay here long, he said, breaking the tense silence. They'll know we used the tunnel, and they'll find another way to track us. Lila crossed her arms, her fingers gripping the fabric of her hoodie. And where do we go from here? It feels like we're always one step ahead, but just barely. Richard gestured toward the edge of the lot, where an abandoned fishing boat rested on the sand. We get to the water. My contact will meet us there. A boat? Lila asked, frowning. You think they won't expect that? They'll expect everything, Richard replied bluntly. But the water gives us options. They can't cover every inch of the coastline. As they moved toward the boat, the faint sound of engines hummed in the distance. Lila tensed, glancing over her shoulder. They're coming. Richard nodded, his expression calm but intense. Then we moved faster. They reached the boat, its wooden hull worn and creaking under their weight as they climbed aboard. Richard moved to the small cabin, checking the navigation controls and ensuring the boat had enough fuel to get them out of immediate danger. Meanwhile, Lila stood near the edge, her eyes scanning the dark waters. "Do you trust this contact of yours?" she asked, her voice filled with doubt. "He's reliable," Richard said, not looking up from his work. "But trust is a strong word." Lila turned to him, her frustration bubbling to the surface. "You're putting everything on the line. Your life, this drive, me. And you're not even sure this person will come through?" Richard finally looked at her, his piercing blue eyes unwavering. "You don't survive this long by being sure of anything," he said. "You survive by preparing for every possibility." Lila wanted to argue, to demand more reassurance, but before she could, the sound of engines grew louder. Headlights pierced the darkness as several vehicles arrived at the edge of the lot. Men in dark suits and tactical gear spilled out, their movements swift and coordinated. "They found us," Lila said, her voice trembling. "Of course they did," Richard muttered, pulling a rifle from a hidden compartment in the cabin. He handed her a handgun, his movements deliberate and calm. "Do you remember how to use this?" Lila stared at the weapon in her hands, her fingers shaking. I've never." "You don't need to hit anything," Richard interrupted. "Just make noise. Keep them off balance." Before Lila could protest, a loud voice called out from the edge of the lot. "Devereaux, we know you're here. There's nowhere left to run." Lila's breath caught in her throat. "That's him," she whispered. "The man in the gray suit." Richard didn't react, his focus entirely on the approaching threat. He positioned himself near the cabin door, his rifle aimed at the intruders. "Stay low and follow my lead," he said to Lila. "We're not done yet." The first shot rang out, shattering the silence. Richard's aim was precise, forcing the advancing men to scatter and take cover behind the vehicles. He fired again, hitting one of the headlights and plunging part of the lot into darkness. The man in the gray suit stepped forward, his calm demeanor unnerving. "You're only delaying the inevitable, Devereaux," he called out. "Hand over the drive, and we can end this peacefully." "Peaceful isn't your style," Richard shot back, his voice dripping with disdain. "You made that clear when you poisoned my drink." The man chuckled, the sound cold and calculating. "That was a warning. You've ignored every chance we've given you. Now, you've left us no choice." Richard's grip on the rifle tightened. "You're not getting the drive. Then you'll die for it," the man replied, motioning to his men. A hail of bullets tore through the night, ricocheting off the boat's hull and splintering the wooden planks. Lila ducked behind the cabin, her heart racing as she clutched the handgun. "Richard, we're trapped." "No," Richard said, his voice steady despite the chaos. "We're positioned." He reached into another compartment, pulling out a smoke grenade. "Cover your mouth," he instructed, pulling the pin and tossing it toward the advancing men. Thick white smoke billowed out, enveloping the lot and cutting off the intruders' visibility. "Move!" Richard shouted, grabbing Lila's arm and pulling her toward the edge of the boat. They climbed down the side, dropping onto the sand below. The smoke provided cover, but it wouldn't last long. Richard led Lila toward a cluster of rocks at the edge of the water, their footsteps muffled by the crashing waves. "Are we running?" Lila asked, her voice shaking. "No," Richard replied, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "We're waiting." "Waiting for what?" she demanded. As if in answer, the faint hum of another engine reached their ears. A small speedboat appeared out of the darkness, its single light flashing twice before it cut the engine and drifted closer. A figure stood at the helm, waving them over. "That's our ride," Richard said, pulling Lila forward. They waded into the shallow water, the cold biting at their legs. The man in the boat reached out, helping Lila aboard before offering a hand to Richard. "You've stirred up quite the hornet's nest," the man said, his tone half amused. "Not the first time," Richard replied, climbing aboard. The man nodded toward a lot, where the smoke was beginning to clear. The figures of the intruders were faintly visible, their shouts carrying over the water. They'll have backup soon. We need to move. Richard turned to Lila, who sat shivering on the bench, clutching the handgun he'd given her. You okay? He asked. She nodded, though her pale face and trembling hands told a different story. I think so. The man at the helm revved the engine, the boat cutting through the waves as it sped away from the shore. Richard stood near the back, his gaze fixed on the shrinking lot. The man in the gray suit appeared in the distance, his cold eyes watching as the boat disappeared into the night. Lila glanced at Richard, her voice barely audible over the roar of the engine. Do you think we're safe now? Richard didn't answer right away. He reached into his pocket, pulling out the USB drive. We're safe for now, he said, but the real fight is just beginning. The speedboat carved through the waves under the cover of night, its engine a low growl against the rhythmic crashing of water. Richard stood at the back, his sharp eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of pursuit. Lila sat huddled on a bench near the helm, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. The cold wind bit at her skin, but it was the fear curling in her stomach that made her shiver. The man piloting the boat, a grizzled figure named Harris, glanced back at them. His face, weathered by years of dangerous work, was calm but serious. We've got about 10 minutes before they figure out where we've gone, he said. Where do you want to make landfall, Devereaux? Head for the cove, Richard replied without hesitation. It's secluded enough to buy us some time. Harris nodded, adjusting the throttle. The boat surged forward, cutting through the dark waters like a blade. Lila watched Richard, her unease growing. He hadn't said much since they'd boarded the boat, his focus entirely on the task at hand. She couldn't shake the feeling that he was carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders, or at least the weight of that tiny USB drive in his pocket. Richard, she said softly, her voice barely audible over the wind. Do you really think this plan will work? He glanced at her, his expression unreadable. It has to. That's not exactly reassuring, Lila muttered, pulling her hoodie tighter around her. Richard sighed, moving to sit beside her. For the first time, his steely demeanor softened slightly. I know this seems impossible, he said, but I've been in worse situations. Worse than this? Lila asked, raising an eyebrow. Because this feels pretty bad. Richard allowed a faint smirk to tug at the corner of his mouth. You'd be surprised what you can survive when you don't have a choice. Lila looked at him, her green eyes searching his for any sign of doubt. You really believe we can beat them, don't you? I don't believe, Richard said firmly. I know, but it's not going to be easy. The boat jolted slightly as it hit a rough patch of water, and Harris called back to them. We're nearing the cove. You'd better be ready. If they're tracking you, this is where things might get dicey. Richard stood, his posture steady despite the rocking of the boat. They're tracking us, he said. That's a given, but we'll be ready for them. Lila stood as well, though her legs felt unsteady beneath her. How can you be so sure? Because I've been in their position, Richard replied, and I know how they think. The boat slowed as they approached the cove, the towering cliffs on either side providing a natural shield from prying eyes. Harris cut the engine, letting the boat drift silently toward the shore. The sound of water lapping against the hull filled the air as they moved closer. Richard grabbed a duffel bag from the boat's storage compartment, slinging it over his shoulder. He handed Lila a smaller bag, which felt heavier than she expected. What's in here? She asked. Supplies, Richard said. Weapons, communication equipment, and anything else we might need. Lila hesitated, her fingers tightening around the strap. You really came prepared, didn't you? I don't like surprises, Richard said simply. The boat bumped gently against the shore, and Harris hopped out, securing it with a rope. This is as far as I go, he said, turning to Richard. "You've got what you need." "For now," Richard replied. He extended a hand, which Harris shook firmly. "Thanks for the assist." "Don't thank me yet," Harris said with a grim smile. "They're not going to stop. You know that." Richard nodded. "I know." With that, Harris climbed back into the boat and pushed off, disappearing into the darkness. Richard and Lila stood on the rocky shore, the sound of the waves crashing behind them. The cliffs loomed above, their jagged edges casting long shadows under the faint moonlight. "What now?" Lila asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "We climb," Richard said, nodding toward a narrow path that wound its way up the cliffs. "Climb," Lila repeated, her eyes widening. "You've got to be kidding me. Do I look like I'm kidding?" Richard replied, already moving toward the path. Lila groaned but followed him, her legs protesting with every step. The climb was steep, the loose rocks making it treacherous. She stumbled more than once, but Richard was always there, his hand steadying her before she could fall. By the time they reached the top, her lungs were burning, and her legs felt like jelly. Richard, on the other hand, seemed barely winded. He scanned the horizon, his eyes narrowing as he spotted faint lights in the distance, headlights moving in their direction. "They're coming," he said. "We don't have much time. What do we do?" Lila asked, panic creeping into her voice. Richard opened the duffel bag, pulling out a small drone. He powered it on, the tiny device whirring to life. "We lead them away," he said, attaching a decoy beacon to the drone. "This will buy us time to reach the rendezvous point." He launched the drone into the air, its faint blinking light disappearing into the darkness. Richard watched it go, his expression tense. "They'll follow the signal," he said, "but it won't last long." Lila stared at him, her heart racing. "And what happens when they realize it's a decoy?" Richard met her gaze, his voice steady. "By then, we'll be gone." He slung the duffel bag over his shoulder and motioned for her to follow. They moved quickly, their footsteps muffled by the soft earth beneath them. The cliffs gave way to a dense forest, the towering trees providing cover as they disappeared into the shadows. Lila's mind raced as they weaved through the trees, her breaths coming in short, sharp gasps. "Richard," she said, her voice trembling. "What happens if this doesn't work?" He glanced back at her, his expression unreadable. "It will work. But what if it doesn't?" she pressed. "What if they catch us?" Richard stopped abruptly, turning to face her. His eyes locked onto hers, his voice calm but firm. "Then we fight." Lila stared at him, her fear warring with the determination in his gaze. For a moment, she felt a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, they could survive this. She nodded, her grip tightening on the bag strap. "Okay." They pressed on, the forest swallowing them in its dark embrace. The faint hum of engines in the distance grew louder, but Richard's pace never faltered. He moved with the confidence of a man who had been through hell and come out the other side. And Lila, despite her fear, found herself trusting him. As they neared the edge of the forest, the faint glow of a city skyline appeared on the horizon. Richard stopped, his sharp eyes scanning the area. "We're close," he said. "The rendezvous point is just ahead." Lila exhaled shakily, her heart pounding. They weren't safe yet, but for the first time, she felt like they were getting closer. Together, they stepped out of the shadows, ready to face whatever came next. The glow of the city skyline grew brighter as Richard and Lila approached the edge of the forest. The faint hum of cars and the distant buzz of life felt surreal after hours of running through darkness and silence. But there was no relief, only the looming threat of what was still to come. Richard paused near the tree line, his sharp eyes scanning the surroundings with military precision. "This is it," he said, his voice low but resolute. "The rendezvous point is just beyond that warehouse." Lila followed his gaze to a dilapidated structure on the outskirts of the city. It looked abandoned, its rusted exterior and shattered windows a stark reminder of how far they'd come from the polished world of corporate boardrooms and luxury cars. She hugged her arms tightly around herself, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "Are you sure your contact will meet us here?" "He'll be here," Richard said without hesitation, though the hard edge in his tone betrayed his own doubts. "He knows what's at stake." Lila hesitated, her green eyes searching his face. "And what if he doesn't show?" Richard turned to her, his expression unreadable. "Then we improvise." Before she could respond, the faint rumble of engines reached their ears. Lila's breath caught in her throat, and she instinctively ducked behind a tree. "They're close," she whispered, her voice trembling. Richard nodded, his jaw tightening. He pulled the USB drive from his pocket, holding it up briefly before tucking it into a hidden compartment in his jacket. "No matter what happens," he said, his voice calm but firm, "this drive gets to my contact. It's the only thing that matters." Lila's stomach twisted at the weight of his words. "What about us? What about surviving?" Richard glanced at her, his piercing blue eyes softening ever so slightly. "We'll survive," he said, "but only if we stay focused." The engines grew louder, and headlights appeared in the distance. Richard motioned for Lila to follow him, leading her toward the back of the warehouse. They moved quickly but carefully, their footsteps muffled by the soft earth beneath them. As they reached the rusted door, Richard paused, listening for any signs of movement inside. Satisfied, he pushed it open, the hinges groaning in protest. The interior was dark and cold, the faint smell of mildew hanging in the air. Broken machinery and scattered debris littered the floor, creating a maze of obstacles. Richard led Lila to a shadowed corner, where they crouched behind a stack of old crates. "Stay here," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "And don't make a sound." Lila grabbed his arm, her grip firm despite the fear in her eyes. "You can't take them on alone." "I'm not," Richard said, his tone steady. "I just need to buy us time." Before she could argue, he slipped away, his movements silent and deliberate. Lila's heart pounded as she watched him disappear into the shadows, leaving her alone with the weight of her own thoughts. She clenched her fists, forcing herself to stay calm. Richard had a plan. He always had a plan. Minutes felt like hours as Lila waited, her ears straining for any sound. Then, the warehouse was suddenly flooded with light as the intruders arrived, their flashlights sweeping through the space. The sound of boots on concrete echoed loudly, sending a chill down her spine. "Spread out," a voice commanded. It was cold and familiar. The man in the gray suit. Lila's breath caught as she peeked through a crack in the crates. The man stood near the center of the room, his posture relaxed but commanding. His eyes scanned the darkness, a faint smirk playing on his lips. "Devereaux," he called out, his voice carrying through the warehouse. "You've led us on quite the chase. But it ends here." Richard's voice cut through the shadows, calm and defiant. "Funny, I was about to say the same thing." The man's smirk widened as he gestured for his men to advance. "You're outnumbered and outgunned. Hand over the drive, and maybe I'll let you walk out of here." "You and I both know that's not true," Richard replied, his tone dripping with disdain. "So why don't we skip the pretense?" The man chuckled softly. "Suit yourself." The first shot rang out, shattering the tension. Richard moved quickly, using the crates and machinery as cover. He fired with precision, forcing the intruders to scatter and take defensive positions. The warehouse erupted into chaos, the sharp cracks of gunfire echoing off the walls. Lila pressed herself against the crates, her heart racing. She clutched the handgun Richard had given her, her fingers trembling as she tried to steady her breathing. She had never been in a situation like this before, and every instinct screamed at her to run. But she couldn't. Not now. As the firefight intensified, Richard's voice crackled over the small radio clipped to her jacket. "Lila, are you still there?" She fumbled for the radio, her voice shaking as she replied. "I'm here." "Good," Richard said. "Listen carefully. There's a service ladder on the east side of the warehouse. It leads to the roof. I need you to get up there and signal my contact." "What?" Lila exclaimed, her voice rising despite herself. "I can't." "Yes, you can," Richard interrupted, his tone firm but not unkind. "You're stronger than you think. Now go." Lila hesitated for only a moment before forcing herself to move. She crawled low to the ground, staying out of sight as she made her way toward the ladder. The sounds of gunfire and shouting filled the air, but she focused on putting one foot in front of the other. When she reached the ladder, she looked up, her stomach churning at the height. "You can do this," she whispered to herself, gripping the rungs tightly. Slowly, she began to climb, her muscles protesting with every step. As she neared the top, the sound of engines roared outside. She reached the roof and spotted a helicopter in the distance, its spotlight cutting through the darkness. Her heart leapt with hope as she waved her arms, signaling the pilot. The helicopter drew closer, and a figure leaned out, waving back. Lila grabbed the radio, her voice urgent. "They're here." "Good," Richard replied. "Stay up there and stay out of sight." Below, the fight continued to rage. Richard moved with precision and purpose, taking out one intruder after another. But the man in the gray suit remained untouched, his cold eyes fixed on Richard as he advanced. "You're running out of time, Devereaux," the man said, his voice calm even in the chaos. "The drive. Now." Richard smirked, pulling a smoke grenade from his pocket. "Come and get it." He pulled the pin and tossed it, the warehouse filling with thick smoke. The confusion bought him just enough time to retreat toward the ladder. As he climbed to the roof, the helicopter hovered overhead, its rotors kicking up a deafening wind. "Lila," Richard called out, grabbing her arm. "Time to go." The helicopter lowered a rope, and one by one, they climbed aboard. As the aircraft ascended, Lila looked down at the shrinking figures below. The man in the gray suit stood motionless, watching them escape with a cold, unreadable expression. Richard slumped into the seat beside her, his expression a mix of exhaustion and determination. "It's not over yet," he said, holding up the USB drive. "But we're one step closer." Lila nodded, her fear giving way to a flicker of hope. For the first time, she believed they might actually have a chance. And now, I want to hear from you. Which part of this story touched your heart the most? Leave a comment and share your thoughts. And of course, if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more narratives like this. Each subscription helps us continue bringing exciting stories to you. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.